Harris III. I'm a professor of post-secondary education at San Diego State University and co-director of the Community College Equity Assessment Lab. And I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. J. Luke Wood, who serves as Associate Vice President for Diversity and Innovation here at San Diego State. And we understand that these are very challenging times for everyone. And we honor the work that all of you have done to be responsive to the needs of our students while transitioning your courses and student services from face-to-face to online. And we are excited to share some insights from our work that you may find helpful during this time in this transition. Please note that this webinar is being recorded, and a fully captioned version of the recording will be shared within 24 hours of the webinar. Throughout the webinar, we invite you to ask questions on Twitter using the hashtag #EquityOnline. There are more than 4,500 of you that are registered for this webinar, so we're not able to do question and answer in the ways in which we are accustomed to doing it. So we will use Twitter. At the end of the webinar, we'll answer some questions that are posted on Twitter using the hashtag. We also encourage you to engage each other using the hashtag to the extent that you find it desirable to do so. Also want to let you all know about the next webinar that we plan to do. Is going to have a focus on equity-minded student services in the online environment. Please take a look at the link. You can go ahead and start registering for that webinar. We'll also send some communications out about it via email as well as our social media. Our objectives for today's webinar are twofold. First, we will highlight some of the ways in which culturally diverse students are disproportionately impacted in online courses. And second, and perhaps most important, we will share some strategies for keeping equity at the forefront of the virtual learning experiences we design and deliver to students. Many of you on this webinar have worked tirelessly over the past several years to reconceptualize the ways in which you teach and support students by infusing equity into your work. And it is our hope and expectation that we do not lose the momentum we've established towards this effort. Before we begin, I'd like to offer a few important considerations. First, this is not a technical webinar. Our focus is on teaching and learning practices, and we know that there's a lot of resources and support that's available to colleagues around using learning management systems like Blackboard and Canvas, and we encourage and invite everyone to consider utilizing and accessing those resources. Second, this webinar prioritizes racially diverse students in community colleges, as these students tend to be the most underserved populations in higher education. That said, we know that we have quite a few of our colleagues joining us from four-year institutions. We're grateful for your participation, and we trust that you'll find many of the strategies we present are transferable to the four-year context. And lastly, it's important to understand that this webinar serves as an introduction and an overview to the concepts and the strategies that we will present. We encourage you all to continue to pursue opportunities to deepen your knowledge and to deepen your learning of equity-minded practices, and to build your capacities to make these strategies actionable in an online environment. First, let's begin by making sure we have a shared understanding of what equity means. And at its core, equity is about enacting intentional strategies to address disparities that impact students who experience disproportionate impact, meaning students who are not benefiting from their participation in post-secondary education as much as other students. And we also know from our work that there are groups that consistently experience disproportionate impact on almost every indicator of student success. Notably, our students of color, former foster youth, students who experience basic needs insecurities, students with disabilities, and formerly incarcerated students as examples. And taking this discussion of equity one step further, it's important that we embrace the concept of equity-mindedness. Dr. Stella Ben-Simone, who's a professor in the Rochester School of Education at the University of Southern California, and also the founding director of the Center for Urban Education, is widely credited with giving us this concept. And she describes it as being comprised of primarily four characteristics. First is a recognition of the ways in which systemic inequity disadvantages minoritized people in a range of social institutions and contexts. So we have to understand that the same students who are disproportionately impacted in education are also not well served in our workforce, in our healthcare systems, in the criminal justice systems, and so forth. Second, it is important that we reframe outcome disparities not as an indicator of students' underperformance, but as an indication of institutional underperformance. Third, we must not attribute outcome disparities exclusively to student deficits or perceived deficits in their identities, in their life circumstances, and in their capabilities. And lastly, we must be critically reflective upon our roles and responsibilities as educators and the ways in which we allow inequities to exist and persist. And finally, we must acknowledge that being racially conscious is at the core of equity-mindedness. This is not to say that other forms of oppression and discrimination are not important and should not be acknowledged. But what it does remind us is that race cannot be substituted or overlooked in our efforts to achieve educational equity. As we say, an educator cannot proclaim to be truly equity-minded without being conscious of the realities of race, the mundane racialized experiences of students of color, and the ways in which institutional racism shapes educational access, opportunity, and success in both historical and contemporary US contexts.
All right, everyone. So what we wanted to do is to, in terms of framing this webinar, is to talk about some considerations that we think are important here. A twofold challenge that really faces our underserved students, but is particularly influential on their success in an online learning context. The first issue that we see is that we teach, in general, as educators, how we were taught. And this includes myself. For example, many states don't have credentialing for teaching in general, whether it's a face-to-face context or online context. So let's think about this in reality. Like our average faculty member in biology, right? They went and they got a bachelor's degree in biology. They may have worked in industry for a couple of years, a master's degree, a PhD in biology, or other degree, and then they go directly into the classroom with no real training on how to teach. And so what we know from this is that in general, most professors, they have never received direct instruction on how to teach. So they teach how they were taught. And how they were taught is typically not how our students of color learn. In an online environment, this concern is even more prevalent because few educators have been previously exposed to good online instruction or online instruction at all. So the context and framework for how to do so in an effective way in general and an effective way for diverse learners is something that many of them have not necessarily been exposed to. And so that's an important thing for us to keep in mind. Next slide. We also want to keep in mind that we oftentimes as educators, and unfortunately, ignore the diversity that we don't see. We are, in fact, sometimes even taught to avoid diversity altogether. We ignore diversity, and too often our practices indicate that we don't believe it's important for us to be race conscious. And we're going to talk about this as an important concept here, because in an online course, we might believe to ourselves it's not important because we simply don't see students, right? Race is viewed as being invisible, especially depending upon the mode of instruction, whether it's asynchronous or synchronous. So therefore, we believe it's important for us not to engage in that practice, because when we ignore the diversity that we don't see, then those environments can become even more racially hostile than in-person environments. Why? Because our default in American higher education is to best serve students who are in the majority, and oftentimes that results in further minoritized experiences for our students of color. Next slide. So we just wanted to highlight a few data points, and these are some data points taken from the California community colleges, but they just serve as a general framework for us to understand that in reality, there are disparities that are taking place. And what you see here on the slide is data from the Data Mart, which is from the California Community College System. This is using 2017 data. And then you can see we're going to present data for simultaneous interaction versus delayed interaction. You can think about that in general as being synchronous or asynchronous, right? And what you'll see here in red are groups that fall below the mean for the racial groups and gender groups. And what you'll see is that groups that we see who historically experience disproportionate impact in face-to-face settings are also experiencing disproportionate impact in online learning. So this first one is for course retention for those who are in simultaneous interaction. And you can see here that for our Black, Native American, Latinx, multi-ethnic, and Pacific Islander students, that these students are experiencing outcomes that are different from that of their peers. Their outcomes are lower than that of other groups. On the next slide, we can see that this is even more pronounced in when we're talking about delayed interaction as well. So we have to realize that in some cases, we do see a greater gap in this type of teaching. In the next slide, you can see that these replicate themselves when we go beyond course retention and we start looking at course success. And you'll see here a marked difference in particular for Black male and Black female students. Next slide. We see that this is also, again, pronounced even more so when we're talking about delayed interaction. Next slide. And then we start to realize that when we break this out by types, whether we're looking at in-person, asynchronous, or synchronous, what we see from our analyses is that overall, the students who experience disproportionate impact in general experience it across all levels, whether it's synchronous, asynchronous, or in person, but that the greatest level of disparity is for asynchronous learning modalities. So that's an important point to keep in mind because we're going to come back to it because we don't believe that it means to throw out asynchronous as the strategy here. We think it just means that we have to be more intentional about how we design that type of learning. So in the next slide, I think that we can look at this and see that it also applies across gender groups, so for men and for women. So from this, we see that there are three primary takeaways. First, our students in an online environment experience disproportionate impact, just as they experience disproportionate impact in in-person environments. The second point is that the greatest disparities based on this data seem to be in asynchronous learning environments. And third, when we look at this data by gender, we do see some nuances that further inform what our perspective should be around disparities. Now, again, this doesn't mean that we're going to throw out asynchronous, but it begs the question as to how we actually build these courses. Now, when people view this data, they can view it in different ways. Some people will view this data and they'll say that, through a deficit perspective, that this is a function of students, their families, and their communities. It's because students aren't trying. It's because students have challenges in their external lives. It's this deficit perspective that we see throughout education. But in analyzing this through an equity framework, we should really be thinking about what are we doing or not doing that's resulting in these differences. And our job is to realize what those differences, what we're doing wrong, so that we can do the very best to improve, so that we can ensure that all of our students are doing as well as they can. Next slide.
We also recognize that underserved students face a multitude of challenges in education: persistent racial microaggressions, hostile racial climates, basic needs insecurities, and a lack of access to experiences and resources that prepare them for college, to name a few.
Frank, you're muted.
Hear me now?
Yes.
There we go. Awesome. So we know that underserved students face a multitude of challenges in education, be it persistent racial microaggressions, hostile racial climates, basic needs insecurities, and a lack of resources that prepare them for college, to name a few. We also know, for example, that a critical mass of students of color in community colleges report not having a stable place to live. which has a significant impact on their success in college, but also on their health, their safety, their overall well-being, and so forth. And our colleague, Dr. Sarah Goldrick-Rab at the Hope Center for Social Justice is doing some incredible work in this area. We also know that food insecurities are prevalent among students of color in community colleges. And that said, conditions that have emerged as a result of COVID-19 are likely to exacerbate these and other basic needs insecurities. For example, one has to wonder, how do shelter-in-place orders and a sudden loss of income and financial aid intensify insecurities among students who are already experiencing them? Moreover, we know that campuses have done a great job of providing students access to resources to meet their basic needs, and are doing what they can to continue to do so despite this crisis. But we have to expect that students will be impacted by the fact that these resources are not as easily accessible as they were as recent as 2 weeks ago. One salient example is access to campus Wi-Fi, which many students who are experiencing housing insecurity rely on heavily to complete their coursework. And next, we have to be mindful that students of color experience ongoing social stereotypes that suggest they're intellectually inferior, socially deviant, and come from families and communities that don't value education. And these stereotypes and their corresponding effects do not just go away in online environments. In fact, they can actually be more prevalent in these environments, as they are often devoid of opportunities for faculty and students to establish authentic relationships with each other. We must also be mindful of the effects of implicit bias and the conditions in which it's most likely to be activated, notably at times of high stress, when we have incomplete information, and when time is constrained. And we have to acknowledge that each of these conditions are present in our recent transition to exclusively online environments.
So what we wanted to do is provide a little bit of theoretical context around online learning. And for those of you who have engaged in this work, you're, I'm sure, very familiar with Garrison's 3 presences for online teaching in terms of how do we build a community of inquiry so that students are having a high quality educational experience and learning. And he believes, Garrison, that the 3 presences must be in place to develop and foster this community of inquiry. The first one is a social presence, and it's described as the ability to project oneself and establish personal and purposeful relationships. The 3 main types of social presences are effective communication, open communication, and group cohesion. In other words, it's that relational component that you've heard us talk about a lot. Ultimately, he states that social presence must move beyond simply establishing social emotional presence in personal relationships. He says that that cohesion requires an intellectual focus with open and purposeful communication and respect. Second, he talks about the cognitive presence, and it's defined as the exploration, construction, resolution, and confirmation of understanding through collaboration and reflection in a community of inquiry, moving from an understanding of the problem to basically exploration, integration, application. So think about it as this: information is only good and useful if you can actually apply it. So engaging students in purposeful ways to help them move beyond the tacit acceptance of information to actually applying it. And then the third one is a teaching presence. And he says that faculty need to engage in designing, facilitation, and direct instruction that fosters higher order thinking. These are the explicit techniques that facilitate learning, such as being more directive. So think about this in terms of like challenging our students, right? Almost similar to, for those of you who have a background in student development theory in terms of Naveed Sanford's work on challenge and support, right? Those concepts still apply to us in an online environment. That said, as with most theories that are created that deal with majority populations, when we're talking about our most underserved students, there are still some things that we are missing, still some things that don't allow us to truly meet the needs of our diverse learners. So we've identified 3 of those through our conversations and research that really helped us to inform why this framework is helpful, but it's missing one big component. Those 3 things, next slide, include invisibility. So for example, when we reached out to faculty members who had a successful track record in teaching and learning in an online environment. And they talked about the challenges that students experience. One of the first things that they talked about was invisibility. And this is one faculty member said to us. He said, students of color in my online classes oftentimes express feeling invisible, as what they have to say does not matter. So think about this. How are we making sure that our classes are culturally relevant? How do we make sure that the content is relevant? Have we designed our efforts in a way to reach our the majority of our students, including our minoritized students? And so we want to recognize that invisibility does take place, and we have to move beyond that. So the next one is accessibility. And this is what one person said, they said some of our most underserved students of color might not have a laptop with a camera and microphone. And I think that many colleges and universities are experiencing this right now with the rapid transition to virtual learning, where students may not have access to all the tools that they're going to need. It said, given this, the online classroom should be portable and able to be viewed using a handheld phone. Some might argue that there are not enough computers at libraries and centers that students can use. Think about this. What happens when those libraries and centers are closed? That might be true, but it's a matter of the student having the time to go to a library center, which would need to be just about every day to use those computers. Also, the computers at most library and centers have a time limit. The phone allows students to connect to the classroom while they're on the bus, on break, or helping their kids with their homework. And so in our current social context, we have to recognize that these challenges of accessibility are even greater than they have been before. And so what we have to recognize is that we have to engage strategies to learn about what technology do our students have right now, so that we can be creative in ensuring that the content we have is actually reaching them. Next slide. We also have to realize that in general, and this is even before COVID, that there were external pressures that our students were experiencing. One person said, attendance and time management can sometimes be problematic for underserved students of color because of their various responsibilities within the family structure and the challenges they might sometimes encounter in life. These issues do not simply disappear in an online course. In fact, they can be even more relevant. Now, this is not to have a deficit perspective about the students themselves, but to realize that because of societal oppression and discrimination, that students experience external pressures. And those external pressures are now being experienced by everyone in our society. But let's be real, the pressures that our students of color experience are probably even more manifold now than they were before, even in comparison to their peers. So in reality, we have to recognize that these are sometimes students who are still working and exposing themselves in difficult experiences in terms of their health. They are in families where they're trying to share a multi-generational household while also trying to focus on their school. Let's be real, our communities of color are more affected now than probably ever before. So next slide. So with that in mind, Garrison's framework is helpful, but only when we realize that they're asked to also be not just a social presence, a cognitive presence, or a teaching presence, but an equity presence. We have to be equity-minded. First of all, we have to have a lens of institutional responsibility. If there are issues around success, then we have to think about, is that a reflection of me? We have to reject our deficit perspectives and viewpoints and be intentional about supporting our most underserved students. And we have to consider how our courses are structured and how that might actually produce structural inequities for our students. Without a lens of equity, you have a lens of oppression. Next slide. So with that, we wanted to show you just some of the data that we have available that we've collected as part of the research that we do. So we have a survey called the Community College Instructional Development Inventory. And what it does is it collects data from faculty members across the country who are teaching in general, whether it's face-to-face or online. And so what we've done is we've looked at the data for our online, those who are teaching primarily online within our samples, to see what they're talking about in terms of professional development needs. And what we've done is we've looked at this around concepts that we know are important in the research: relationship building, being culturally relevant, validating practices, collaborative learning, etc. So on the next slide, the first thing that you're going to see is that in terms of professional development needs, we asked them, what are the areas that you feel like you don't need training in? And the number one and number two areas that they say that they don't need training in is racial microaggressions and intrusive teaching and learning practices. Now, let's be real. As Frank said, implicit bias is most prevalent when there are three conditions in place. One, when we have incomplete information. Second, when our time is constrained. And third, when we're experiencing stress or when we're in heightened emotional states. Right now, the conditions for implicit bias are now more present than ever before. Given this, what we're seeing is that these current times are bringing out the very best in some of our faculty, but also the very worst in others. And so we have to realize that microaggressions, while some people say it's the least important area, in an online environment, we would actually argue that it may be one of the most important things. Next slide. Now, when we look at the areas that they say that we do have needs in, we can see that there's needs across the boards. And so what you'll see is that in this webinar, we've purposely designed it to address some of these greater areas of needs in terms of building relationships and validating students, in terms of being culturally relevant. And in subsequent webinars, we're going to do the same thing. And then next slide. We also looked at what people said in terms of additional things, and we asked them about what are areas that you don't need any support in because you're already proficient. One of those areas was performance monitoring, followed by conveying high expectations and welcoming engagement. And so we think that's important to keep in mind, but also with this sample was originally those who were already teaching online, with the vast majority of faculty being immediately shifted to an online context. We have to realize that there's probably needs for other faculties who haven't had the level of training that some have. Now, you may be asking yourself this question: did we look at the data that we have in terms of those who teach primarily online versus those who teach face-to-face to see if there were differences in what they said? And you know what? We found that there were really no differences, that the patterns were generally the same. And so we think that that's important for us to really remember that being race conscious and racially aware is even more important now than ever before. Next slide.
And so with this, we now like to transition the webinar to some of the practices that we like to offer. And it's important to recognize that these strategies that we propose, they come from a rich body of work that we've been engaged in since 2011. And you'll find that all of these practices are aligned with many of the concepts that we've talked about today. Equity-Mindedness and institutional responsibility, our social ecological outcomes model, which we don't have time to unpack fully in today's webinar, but it serves as a conceptual framework for all of the work that we do. You'll also find that some of the practices we share are going to be broadly applicable across subject areas and contexts, and that you may also find that others are going to be more applicable to a specific context. With that in mind, the goal of everything that we offer is to obtain an optimal balance between challenge and support, right? While also conveying high expectations and demonstrating authentic care. So to infuse equity-mindedness in virtual teaching and learning environments, we must do 5 things. First, we must be intrusive. Second, we must be relational. Third, we must be culturally affirming and relevant. Fourth, we must be community focused. And finally, we must also be racially conscious. And in presenting these strategies, we're going to share some representative quotes from equity-minded colleagues who've been teaching online and shared their experiences with us in a recent research project we conducted that focused on infusing equity into community college teaching.
So here we go. Let's jump into the strategies, which is I know why everyone is here. So the first strategy that we want to talk about is being intrusive. Now, what does it mean to be intrusive? It means for us to, in a positive way, intrude and to engage students proactively without waiting for them to come to us. So we want to think about this as an important concept, especially in an environment where students are experiencing incredible pressures, that we have to be proactive, that it is not incumbent for the student to reach out to us, but for us to reach out to them and to continue to do so. So we're making sure that no one is falling down through the cracks, that no one is not being served. So on the next slide, we have some recommendations on how we can actually do that. The first thing we recommend is conduct an informal assessment of students' experiences in online learning. So now this is in general a concept that we can think about for any online class, but is probably even more prevalent and important right now, given that we have students who may have never taken online classes before who are now being taught online. And similarly, we have faculty members who've never taught online before and are now being teaching online. So we need to conduct a base level assessment. The first thing you should do is ask your students, is this the first time you've taken a class online? How are you accessing this class? Are you using a private computer, a public computer? Are you using a tablet, a mobile phone? Like how are you actually getting this information? Because that might be important for you to know in terms of what students have, and for some students, what they don't have. And that you should keep that in mind so that you can create variable opportunities for students to be able to engage. What concerns do you have about taking this course? How can I best facilitate your learning in this course? And are there any other concerns or information that you would like to share? You should do that from the very onset with every single student. It may be even more important to ask that last question, because you might hear issues about food insecurity, housing insecurity. You might hear about transportation concerns, other factors that are really putting pressures on our students. The second thing you need to do is prepare and email the students with a brief orientation to the course that introduces them to your learning management system and other technology that they're going to need. If you're in, like most of us are, on courses that have already begun, then do that now. Send a video of yourself, especially if you're using an asynchronous modality. And when you do so, be enthusiastic, especially in a time when everything else seems so depressing. It would be nice to engage students in a very positive and affirming way. Provide asynchronous alternatives. Now, you might be asking yourself why we would say this, given that we just showed data that shows that asynchronous might not be the best way to do this. And the last recommendation we have here shows why that's important. You can record all class sessions and then make it available to them so that they can reach it at different times. So that, hey, if I'm unable to be able to get to the class at this time, that I would have access to it in a different way. Why? Because right now, flexibility is key. We need to be as flexible as possible so that we're meeting the needs of all of our students, recognizing that the typical traditional, I'm going to stand and deliver, I'm going to give them content at this time, I'm going to do this the way that I've always done it, will not work with our current students and in this current climate. On the next slide, we also believe it's important for us to make success in the course transparent. Now, before I get to these recommendations, I want to give this caveat. First, this has to be done in a very careful way. You have to make success transparent while also not putting down your students. For example, we've heard faculty members who've said, this was already a difficult class. I can imagine it's going to be even more difficult online. Probably not the best way to start out the class, right? Especially given the recent transition. But being proactive about making sure that students are aware of what the expectations are is important. So transparency and being proactive in answering the question, what will it take to be successful in the class? Putting that out there for them to know. Talking about what are the different resources that are available to them. Now, most universities and colleges right now are sending out resources about basic needs and emergency responses, about access to technology and emergency scholarships. So just make sure that also as part of this, that you're sending that information to your students so that they're aware of it, so that they're not just getting it in one email that might come from the university, but they're also getting it from you as a faculty member. It's not only just good practice for being intrusive, it's also a way of showing that you care. And thinking about how should I approach the readings, begin to study and prepare for the exams, take and organize my notes. Just be real, provide really good instruction for what that actually means for the students in this time so that they know exactly what's expected of them and how they can be successful. Now, let me just say this. Some of you might be saying to yourself, like, I don't actually know totally the answers to those questions right now, given this rapid transition. So if you're going to have grace with yourself around that, you should also think about how can you have grace with your students. Next slide. We also want to use assessment strategies that focus on continuous improvement and progress toward demonstrating proficiency by the end of the course. So using assessment strategies that can break things up, for example, into smaller assignments with lower total points versus larger assignments with big points. For example, some classes might have had a structure where they were using a midterm and then a final. That might actually not be the best approach right now. We need to meet learners where they're at and not what is best for us necessarily, but thinking about what is best for them. Part of that involves, again, doing that foundational work of asking students what's going on so we can respond to it. Davidson 2015 suggests that non-text-based assignments and activities such as multimedia presentations, speeches, debates, and role plays may also be important. And we also agree with that as a recommendation. The idea is to have variable ways in which students can complete assignments, given that we're living in a variable society where information is dynamic. Grade based on effort, and also grade and give lots of feedback. We want to make sure that we're making sure that we're giving the students the type of feedback that they need. And feedback should be personalized to the extent possible. So, for example, notes about students' improvement, resources that students might find helpful, suggestions for extending novel ideas and concepts. You can also offer alternative course grading options. For example, if it is approved by your institution to do so, consider whether you can do a satisfactory progress or a pass, no pass. Now, these also have financial aid implications. So don't do anything that is not in alignment with your existing university policy, because you don't want to do something that you think is helping students while then simultaneously creating greater disproportionate impact for students who might be athletes or students who might need certain classes to be able to transfer or to go on to graduate programs. So it's actually complex in terms of offering alternative grading options. So whatever you do, you need to do in consultation with your department chair, with your dean, and with your vice president of instruction or provost. Next slide. So in general, the focus here is on performance monitoring, right? But let me explain what that is, right? Performance monitoring is basically interceding before it's too late, before students have left. One of the things that we have found in our work routinely is that oftentimes educators wait until it's too late. The student who becomes disengaged is harder to engage than the student who is in the margins. We don't want to wait for a student to give up or withdraw or to drop the class. And that's what should be a big concern for us right now. Especially given what might be variable add drop deadlines across multiple institutions and what that might mean for students' financial aid moving forward. So we want to, in general, promote mandatory interaction. And at what point, so this is one thing that we hear around this a lot. Some people say, you can be too intrusive. You can be too intrusive to the point where you're coddling students. I believe that there's no such thing. Our job is to create a net of support that is so tight that students cannot drop through it. And this is what one faculty member said. He said, you must monitor them and catch problems and address them before it's too late. Loss of points for attendance and submitting assignments discourage students from persisting. If a student is late on assignment and figured they will lose so many points a day and they are 3 days late, they'll most likely not see any point in submitting a late assignment. Then there's a snowball effect. One, they're late and then they do not turn in several assignments. They do not see a need to continue to attend the class. The end result is a failed grade. A couple failed grades and they will not see a need to continue going to school. So we want to intercede before it's too late, and we have to be proactive. We're providing them with numerous follow-ups. In the next slide, we also talk about some other important considerations. In general, what we have to do is we have to intervene, right? We have to intervene. One faculty member, she said, I use an early alert system to try and help students that are not turning in assignments, such as a phone call, some words of encouragement, and then allowing them to get points afterwards to get some points for their efforts. I try to reach out before things get out of control. This brings us to a concept that Frank and I have talked about a lot, and that is help seeking. We know from our research that students of color in general, minoritized students in general, and men of color in particular may have challenges in seeking out help because of societal stereotypes. From a masculine perspective, these are assumptions that if I have to ask for help, that I am weak or inferior. And from a racialized context, it's these notions that I am not intelligent, that I'm not good enough. And what happens if I ask for help? Does that mean that those assumptions and stereotypes are right? So because of this, we're not just being intrusive for the sake of being intrusive, but because it's good practice for minoritized students. The last thing here that I'd like to do before turning it back over to Frank is note that we have to engage in referrals. There are lots of resources that students need, whether it's for basic needs or for tutoring. And a lot of those resources are transitioning online. If you haven't transitioned them online, again, attend our next webinar on this topic. But ultimately, what you have to do is have a list of individuals in those areas who are going to validate students, have high expectations for them, and care about their success. So we've talked about this concept a lot called connect students to people, not services. Connect students to people, not services. What does that mean? It means this, that I don't want to just say, hey, go to this person who's in the basic needs area, or go to tutoring online, or contact this person, or contact student services in general. Instead, what I want to do is to give them individuals who I know will care about them and care about their success. In a face-to-face context, people talk about this as a warm handoff, right? Where we maybe walk students over and we connect them to somebody who, in person, who we know is going to care about them. Well, believe me this, you can't do a warm handoff to a cold person. In an online environment, that's even more true. What we have to do is identify those individuals who we know are going to care about them and their success, and make direct connections to them. So for example, if I find out a student is having a basic needs concern, and I know someone who works in that area, maybe I'm doing an email introduction in a way that so the student feels like they need to follow up, where it's not a new instance of help seeking. Or maybe what I'm doing is I'm picking up the phone and I'm calling the colleague, and I'm scheduling a time for me, that colleague, and the student who is maybe in tutoring or maybe in career services or whatever that student might need, and making that connection and setting up a Google Hangout for us all to get on at the same time. Whatever we do, we want to make sure that it's hands-on and that we're connecting them to individuals that we know will care about them and their success. Because again, what we're seeing right now is that this time is bringing out the best in people, but also the worst in people. So we want to connect them to what will be the very best of our institution. Next slide.
So in order to be intrusive and to enact a lot of the practices that Luke just talked about, we have to be relational. And it's thinking about it in this way. Authentic relationships between students and faculty that are grounded in trust, that are grounded in mutual respect, and that are grounded in authentic care, be it in an online environment or an in-person environment, are absolutely critical to students and student success. And to take this concept a little bit further, these relationships are actually more likely to be established when faculty take on the responsibility of creating the conditions for them to emerge. So we often talk about this as avoiding the ask me first and approach me first perspective, that it's really faculty have to assume some responsibility in creating the conditions for these relationships between students and faculty to emerge. One of the most important things that we have to do in being relational is demonstrating to students and letting them know that we care about them and that we are invested in their success, particularly at a time in which we find ourselves now, right? So part of what we can do in building relationships is first and foremost humanizing ourselves, right? Talking with students and sharing with students things about ourselves, personal information, perhaps information about our background, information about our experiences that they may find insightful, in order to reduce these artificial barriers that often exist between students and faculty. And it's even important to do this even in an online environment and an online context. We also must be willing to engage with students on both academic matters, so matters that are related to the course and the content in which we're teaching, but we cannot overlook and miss opportunities to engage with students on non-academic matters as well. Because it's these non-academic matters and these conversations on which relationships are based and formed. We often share that it would be important for faculty to learn at least one thing about each student in their course that has nothing to do with them being a student. So their name, perhaps their hometown, hobbies and activities that they enjoy doing, special talents that they may have, favorite books, favorite movies, music artists, whatever it may be. And Luke mentioned earlier that it would be good to perhaps share a 1-minute video about yourself, and perhaps you can use this as an early assignment for students to do. Give them options if they're going to do it. Either they can do it in a short video, or maybe in some other way of doing it. And we encourage faculty to do the same thing as well, as some of the first ways in which we can start early efforts to build relationships with students. We also have to convey what's called unconditional positive regard. And this concept comes from some of the counseling theory work, in which we really have to see ourselves, see our students as being fully capable of being successful, and that we have to engage them and approach them in very non-judgmental ways. Part of what we have to do also is reject deficit perspectives about students. We all have them, we all have our concepts, and we've all been socialized as educators to think about student success in a particular way, or to think about what a successful student looks like in a particular way. And now more than ever, we have to be very intentional about rejecting those ideas and rejecting those concepts about students' intellectual capabilities or their quote unquote fit for college. We also know from the work of Laura Rendon that validation is really important, particularly for students who've been underserved in education. Validation and positive messaging are absolutely critical, especially at a time like this. So students have to hear on a consistent basis that they belong here, that we believe that they can do the work and do what we're asking them to do, that they can be successful, that they have the ability to do what's expected of them, and that they're intelligent. And think about this, for many of our underserved students, you might be the first educator that ever said this to them. And these are not just things that you have to say to students. We can use opportunities when we're providing feedback on assignments or something. If a student does a really good job of unpacking a concept, using those as opportunities to validate students, validate their abilities in order to be, both their effort and their ability to be successful. And above all, students have to know that we have high expectations for them, that we expect them to do well, that we're going to be disappointed when they don't do well, not only disappointed in themselves, but also disappointed in us and our performance as educators and preparing them to be successful and to do well.
We also believe that it's important to be culturally relevant and affirming. And being culturally relevant and affirming is something where we believe that we have to reach students in terms of their culture, but then affirm them and their culture. Now, you might be saying to yourself, I just put my class online. And maybe that means for you that you have recorded lectures that you always use. Or maybe that means that you're simply Zooming, Skyping, or using some other material to deliver your content. But whatever it is, if you're not being intentional about being relevant, then you're being intentional about being irrelevant. Next slide. So a culturally affirming experience entails the following. This is according to scholars such as Gloria Ladson-Billings and some of the work that we've done as well. Educators' ability to connect course content to students' lived experiences, centering students' diversity in every aspect of the teaching, acknowledging and leveraging cultural strengths and assets, and mirroring diverse students in course content, perspectives, and materials. And we'll provide some examples as to what that actually means. On the next slide, we want to just first begin by noting that it is beneficial for us to be culturally relevant, for us to teach in a way that honors the lives and experiences of the students that we're serving. Why? Because it addresses their unique cultural experiences, but it also values students and helps to grow their self-efficacy, their confidence in their academic abilities, their intrinsic interest, their authentic interest in what they're learning, their sense of belonging, their perceptions of degree utility or the importance of college and healthy concepts around gender and masculine identity for men. And so we see that being culturally relevant, and this is based upon extensive research, being culturally relevant benefits minoritized students, but it is also something that benefits everyone. It has an intensive benefit for our most minoritized students while also simultaneously benefiting other students. On the next slide, we provide a couple examples as to what that means based upon comments that we've received and perspectives we received from not students, but faculty who've been part of our research studies. The first one focuses on course text. One faculty member said, select literature and reading material that are inclusive of students of color. This is important when creating an online environment that will address the needs of all students. Students of color normally find that their voices are absent from the literature. Having multicultural readings validates the experiences of the students. Now, let me say this. You might be saying to yourself, but I'm barely getting my class online. I'm barely having the time to just put what I've been doing into a format that students can receive. So I want to first acknowledge that that is a challenge that a lot of people are experiencing right now. But I also want to say that this is a great opportunity for you to do the things that you haven't done before. And if you think that by taking that class and putting it online, that it's going to help reach all of your students, if it's a class that has not been done historically in a relevant way, then you're probably not reaching the students in the way that you need to. We also want to focus on culturally relevant teaching through variable assignments. The quote says, universal design for learning has also been effective. All students in my online course are graded via diverse forms of assessment. Students in my class can submit a PowerPoint, a poem, a written paper, or produce a video demonstrating their learning. This gives students the opportunity to choose how they best demonstrate what they understand and learn best, often empowering them to produce knowledge. And again, this is a strategy that's important in general, but maybe even more important right now. If after that initial assessment that we talked about in the Be Intrusive section that you've done, you might learn that students have access to different types of platforms, whether it's a computer or a tablet or a phone. So having variableness in the ways that they can use those modalities to essentially engage in the course content is something that's important. Next slide. Other things that we think are really important is the physical design of the course, right? So course images. So faculty use PowerPoints that will tend to use stock images that only have white people. If the subject is not diversity, then default to images of white people. I encourage folks to use multiple race, gender, age, ability images to be inclusive of the subject as opposed to a singular group. Another one said, I think about the images I use in the online environment. Being conscious about this is important. The aesthetic of the online environment. It is a welcoming environment for all students, but particularly minoritized students. On the next slide, we talk about why this actually matters. And this is based upon research that I've conducted with a colleague, Wendy Bracken at San Diego State. And this actually is a study that is about to come out in Western Journal of Black Studies. But basically what we did is we looked at what is called the concept of mirrors and windows. So for those of you who are experienced with the theories in reading education, you might know about the concept of what are called window books versus mirror books. So a window book is when a student is looking out through the window into the life of someone else, the stories, the characters, the storylines, just the overall tone of the story is one that is not reflective of them or their experience. Versus a mirror book is when they are looking into a mirror and they're seeing themselves, that the lives, the stories, the characters, the storylines are reflective of them. And so what we did is we took this notion of window books and mirror books to look at a concept that we call the mirror effect. What happens when we create our online environments where we have pictures and images that are racially salient? So what we have is a concept that's called mirror artifact, exposing students to racially salient images that highlight their contributions to society. And what we have postulated is that essentially when students are exposed to images that are racially salient, that they will have increased self-esteem, increased confidence in their abilities, a greater sense of belonging, and greater resilience. And when they aren't exposed to those images, that it will increase their stereotype threat, that they'll have greater levels of stress, anxiety, and depression. And so what we did, and this is perfect for this current setting and context, is we gave students an online test. And in that online test, students were exposed to just the information in one context where it was just the test itself, and then in another context, the header and footer of the online environment had racially salient images of diverse learners. And what we thought is that if they're exposed to these positive images of diverse learners, and not just diverse learners in this specific context, in this particular study, it was racially salient images of individuals who they thought were inspirational, that what we would find is that they would have essentially that they would have lowered stress and lowered anxiety. But what we did was we wanted to basically make it so that this was heightened. So some of the questions that they were given in this actual study had no real answers to them. So it was a deception study. And just jumping to the punchline, this is what happened. When students were exposed to racially salient images in that online testing environment, what we found is that they had reduced anxiety and reduced levels of stress and stereotypes. Positive mood states, and we're lowering those negative mood states. So we think that that's important. So your PowerPoints, your lectures, the images that you have, the books that you assign, everything that you do should be done from a racially salient and culturally relevant standpoint. Next slide.
Our fourth strategy focuses on building community. And it's important to recognize that faculty teaching online must enact strategies to build community with and among students. So earlier, Luke talked about mandatory interaction. So mandatory interaction is not only a way to be intrusive, but also as a way to build community in your online, with your online learners in this new context in which we find ourselves. And in doing so, it's important for faculty to model the type of engagement that they expect to see from students. So we talked about doing the videos, anything that you're asking students to do with regard to engagement and participation, you should also be doing the same thing and modeling what you expect from students. And that even also involves being active in class discussion boards, group chats, forums, and so forth. And having a set of community norms that are established at the beginning of the course and agreed upon by both students and faculty is also an important way to build and sustain community. And we would say that at a minimum, your community norms should establish expectations for communication in terms of how we're going to communicate and how often, expectations for how we're going to give and share critical feedback with each other, what type of language is appropriate within our learning community, how we're going to share and exchange perspectives and so forth. And we also think it's helpful that if you have the opportunity for everyone in the course to see each other during synchronous class session, that also really goes a long way in helping to build and sustain an online community. Now, in doing so, we have to be mindful about some of the basic needs and insecurities that we talked about earlier, recognizing that students might be accessing the course in a number of different ways, and students may have limited access to Wi-Fi or Wi-Fi with a high enough bandwidth. So again, flexibility is really important here. So I would encourage students to do it, but maybe it's not something that you absolutely require. It's also important for students to be able to engage outside of class and build community in that regard. So getting students together and giving them opportunities to work in study groups, online study groups, group projects, virtual meetups to where everyone agrees to meet online, be it through Zoom or Google Hangout or whatever it may be, whatever medium that you find helpful and comfortable, and just being able to be online together for a period of time, and even creating a class social media page or using hashtags and so forth for students to be able to build an online community. Sharing perspectives also really helps to build and sustain community. So being able to share and exchange perspectives, and it's really helpful if you can do this and keep this connected to topics that are related to the course but also that have some relevance to the day-to-day lives and experiences of students. So think about some of the concepts and ideas that Luke just shared with regard to being culturally relevant and culturally affirming. It would be important to apply those same concepts in this regard. We had a colleague who shared, students can share their stories with other students, often creating a community of scholars and leaders seeking ways to better their communities and lives. And finally, using collaborative learning as a strategy to build community. So you can do this in class, right? So for synchronous in-class sessions, or also for longer term projects. So, you know, regardless of the approach that you take, it gives students an opportunity to, that they tend to be beneficial for the learning and engagement of disproportionately impacted students. So if you're gonna do this and if you're gonna use collaborative learning, it's important that you give students the tools that they need to collaborate effectively. So don't assume that they already know how to do this because they're working in teams, in their workplaces or in other contexts and spaces in which they find themselves. So it's important to create some guidelines for collaborative learning, give students rubrics in order to be able to assess themselves on their collaborative learning and engagement. And most importantly, to have periodic check-ins with groups to increase, and all of these strategies will increase the likelihood that it will be a valuable learning experience and an opportunity for all students. The last point with regard to collaborative learning is making sure that you're intentional about how you go about forming groups. Recognizing that self-selection is not always the best approach, first and foremost, because in an online environment, students may not know each other and they may not have had the opportunity to meet each other. And also thinking about some of the things that we shared earlier in this webinar is that some students may have social stereotypes about certain groups and certain types of students. So thinking about some ways in which you can get students to work collaboratively without the typical, hey, find a classmate or find 3 or 4 classmates to collaborate and work together within a group setting.
And then we also, of course, want to encourage you to be race conscious. This is one of the most important recommendations we have. It means that we don't ignore race. We don't ignore conversations on race. Why? Because this is the life and experiences of the students that we serve. Next slide. So we have a few recommendations on how to do that. First, we want to be intentional about providing opportunities to engage racial and equity issues within the context of the course. Now, I want to acknowledge that this does not work for all classes depending upon the type of class that it is, but if it does, it's even better. Talk about issues of disparity. There's a lot of disparity going on right now, particularly with COVID. So being real makes for a better connection with the students. The second is give students the tools that they need to productively engage in racial dialogue in the course and make sure that you also have the tools needed to facilitate that dialogue. But let me give you a bit of recommendations around this. First, expose yourself to the research on microaggressions. Daryl Ring-Su's work, Chester Pierce's work on microaggressions, so you understand what that is and how that's going to manifest, because it's going to look different in an online environment. And then also what we want to do is make sure that we are engaging students in those dialogues, but we're staying present in the dialogue to monitor it and to intervene when necessary. So, and let me say something about this. Messages can be lost in translation, especially if you're using a text as a primary tool. So if, for example, you're engaging students in discussions about racial issues in a group chat rather than what would have normally been an in-person discussion. So I'd actually recommend avoiding textual materials if you're going to do this. It may be better to have breakout rooms with Google Hangouts so that people can have conversations, because what you don't want is somebody to send something in textual form and have it be misconstrued because the tone, the manner in which it's meant could be taken out of context. Whatever you do, you have to make sure that you monitor and just remember that you have a responsibility to ensure that students of color are not being microaggressed. If you also want some additional tools on this, Sean Harper's Racial Justice Institute's help to build capacity around this. And if you want, we really recommend going to their website for the USC Race and Equity Center at race.usc.edu. That's race.usc.edu. And just remember on the next slide that when there are people there are microaggressions. So we have to address microaggressions. And one faculty member said, you need to monitor discussion groups for microaggressions. In online classes, the discussion boards are a major point of contention. Folks make comments, many from their limited racial experiences, that tend to have all kinds of racial undertones or overtones. Many faculty don't have the skills to address those issues. And if you don't, feel free to reach out to us. We have a bunch of resources on how to engage this. In fact, we feel like this is probably one of our areas of specialty. And then lastly, just embracing racial discourse. One person said, I'm always thinking about race in the ways that I design, teach, and interact with my students online. I intentionally infuse race into my work. I try to facilitate dialogue and pose questions that address issues of race and racism in society. We talk about these issues. We encourage you to also talk about these issues. Next slide.
So with that, that brings us to the conclusion of our webinar. We want to thank everyone for your participation and engagement. Just as a reminder, we're going to be taking some questions online on Twitter using the Equity Online hashtag. So we're going to get started in that in just a few minutes. Before we transition to the Q&A part of the discussion, we want to remind you that we are involved with some colleagues at the Center for Organizational Responsibility and Advancement. So you can go to coralearning.org and look at some of the professional development offerings that we have, some that focus on microaggressions, some that focus on unconscious bias, and several of the other concepts that we talked about in today's webinar. We also want to shout out some colleagues at the Center for Urban Education who's going to be facilitating another webinar related to supporting students during COVID-19. So you have the information here, so go ahead and register and take a look at it and get involved as well. So Luke, do you want to take the first question?
I thought you were going to, but I can do that, yeah. I'm actually looking for it. Do you see one?
No, I see a lot of comments, but not very many questions.
All right, here's the first one. It says, are there support groups starting for students to engage in reflective practices? So I'm personally not aware of any support groups for students. I'm aware of a number of different support groups that have emerged for faculty on social media. So I would definitely encourage you to essentially engage in those communities. And I think as a faculty member, it might be important for you to think about creating those support networks for your students. So many students on a college or university campus will be connected to a club or organization or program designed for students who might experience disproportionate impact, right? Think about how can I create similar things? And we're going to be talking about that in our webinar that's coming up on student services. So that might be another good place for that to occur. But I think you can do the same thing with your classes as well.
Great. Getting quite a few questions about how to address racial microaggressions online, such as in discussion boards and other forums. I want to refer to a suggestion that Luke offered, is that we have to first and foremost be very careful about using textual exchanges as an opportunity to do so. So again, these conversations and discussions might be better addressed in a smaller breakout room or in synchronous conversations, rather than in a discussion board. Also, I think the most important thing that we can do with regard to building our capacity to addressing racial microaggressions is to take a look at the published literature on this topic. So there's a lot that's been written. I would start with the article, Microaggressions in Everyday Life by Derwin Su and his colleagues as a good first step. I would also look at some of the work around racial battle fatigue that William Smith at the University of Utah has highlighted in this regard as well. But we're gonna have to build our capacity pretty quickly, given the transition that we've all had to make to our online classes and being able to recognize and address racial microaggressions. And it would also be important that students understand and have some recognition of what these concepts are. One thing that we know from our work and the work of several colleagues is that racial microaggressions are usually more prevalent when we've activated implicit bias and implicit assumptions. And so again, recognizing the three conditions in which implicit bias is most likely to be present, high stress, incomplete information, and when time is constrained and limited, this would be something that we really need to be mindful and intentional about addressing.
All right, this next question. Well, I would also say that that we're going to be doing a series of different webinars during this time. So we can also do one that focuses specifically on addressing microaggressions in online environments. But our next one will be on student services, but I think we could commit to doing that. It is certainly an area that we do a lot of work in. The next question that came up this is from Karen Chow, and she says, what do you say to faculty who say that it's too much to do all this? What should I prioritize first and most? Well, one thing I would say to those faculty is to recognize that you may be saying that from a standpoint of privilege that your students don't have. Our students are struggling with major financial concerns. They're struggling with major issues of insecurities overall, in addition to the transition to online, in addition to disruption in work. While many of us who work in higher ed and post-secondary education have the privilege of still having gainful employment and being able to deliver the work that we do in an online environment. So I would first of all tell them to think about their own privilege when they say that. And second, from an equity-minded standpoint, to tell them that we recognize that what we're asking you to do is more than you may have been doing before, but that's simply because what we were doing before was not effective. And so if the goal is to be effective and reaching our most minoritized students, then we have to be able to engage and employ these practices. And then what should you prioritize first was the second part of that question. And I would always say, identify the students that you see are struggling, the students who are experiencing disproportionate impact, and start there. Be as intrusive as possible with them, be culturally affirming, be relevant, engage them in every way that you can, and then recognize that that is the starting point and then work out from there. So it's like any other triage structure that you would use.
Next question comes from Julia L. McMillan. Really appreciate the focus on race in this webinar. To what extent do you feel these insights and recommendations can be extended to other underserved groups? I know the contexts have a lot in common, but also unique. So one thing we know that we didn't talk much about in this webinar is the concept of intersectionality. So even when we're prioritizing and focus on race and racial equity, we still have to recognize that our students have other salient identities. So it could be their gender, could be their sexual identity, it could be their socioeconomic status, their ability, and so forth. And so I would say we need to prioritize race because of some of the data points that we shared in this webinar around race being really the identity in which most people are disproportionately impacted. But we also have to have an intersectional perspective in how we do it, and recognizing that it is about race, but it's not exclusively about race. Even in engaging our students who identify as racial ethnic minority students, that they have other salient identities that we have to be mindful of and that we have to be in service to as well.
And let's see, this is coming from Maya Winston. Says, our organization is currently restricting camera usage to help maintain adequate bandwidth for the increased traffic. What ideas do you have to help engagement for that instance? I would say that, yeah, I mean, that can be something that that some institutions are dealing with. Of course, not all. I would say that to the extent that it's within the policies of your own institution to consider alternative strategies for engaging students using, if you're able to, and it's appropriate for your institution, FaceTime, Google Hangout, or other types of services that would allow you to be able to engage students directly. I would say that there's a lot of other options out there that can be either low cost or no cost. And so I would say do whatever is needed to reach your students in this time.
Next question comes from Laura Sirocco. What are your views on going gradeless as a way to promote equity? There's a lot of conversations that are taking place around what to do about grades and evaluation. Given the fact that both students and instructors have had to make this rapid transition to online classes. And I know that there's a lot of consideration on maybe using pass no pass options, and giving students somehow trying to minimize the impact on students' grade point averages and so forth. And I think, again, now is a time that we should be incredibly flexible and include and consider all options, right? With the focus on educational equity and student success in mind. So if there's a way to give students options of using a pass no pass option for courses, as opposed to a letter grade that can have an adverse impact on their GPA, I think it's appropriate to do so from a perspective of being equity and equity minded, especially when we think about the students who are perhaps has the fewest resources and capacity to make this transition. So our students who are already disproportionately impacted. And so again, in doing so, make sure that there is ongoing collaboration with the instructional side of the college or the university. So making sure that the vice president for instruction is involved, and that there's some consideration about how doing so might have an impact on students' financial aid, for example, or other benefits to which they may be eligible for. So veteran students is another group that we have to be mindful of in this regard as well. But I think when it comes to grading and evaluation, this is an area where we have to be incredibly flexible and do everything we can to minimize the impact on students' long-term success and opportunities.
Frank, this question comes from Angel Resendez, but it's definitely more so directed towards you. Asking, can you please elaborate on healthy concepts of gender and masculinity and how it relates to current time?
Yeah, certainly. So, one thing we know from our work is that our men of color tend to really have challenges around gender and masculinity that have an impact on their success. So we find that there are 3 patterns related to gender and masculinity that we consistently see in the work that we do. The first is an apprehension to seeking help, right? Which is going to be it's really salient at a time like this. We know that men are often socialized to embrace the notion that they're independent, they can stand on their own 2 feet, they don't need help and so forth. So they are probably going to be the students who are least likely to not only ask for help and support, but to also accept help when it's offered and to follow through on the help that they've received. So the whole concept of being intrusive that we spoke about in the webinar really applies to these students. So having to make sure that we're doing everything we can to facilitate help seeking, proactive and timely help seeking, for our men in general and men of color in particular. We also find that there tends to be concerns around the breadwinner perceptions. So connected to the idea that men, particularly men who have families and people that they're responsible for, are socialized first and foremost to be breadwinners. And the idea of fulfilling the role of a breadwinner supersedes other salient identities that they may have. So, being a student is not more important than putting food on the table and taking care of my family. And we really have to be mindful of this at this time when people are losing jobs, losing income, losing access to things that they thought that they would have that would facilitate them in being able to pursue post-secondary education. When those resources suddenly go away and those opportunities suddenly go away, then concerns and questions about how do I take care of myself and my family really become salient. So again, recognizing that for men and for men of color, this is a pattern that we have to be very mindful of. And the last one is just even the idea or perception of school as a feminine space or a feminine domain. So, when we think about early socialization in middle school and in high school, the idea that, the young men who are successful in sports and things like that's what they tend to receive validation for, and less so around being good students and having good grades and behaving and so forth. And so for our men, and in particular our men of color, they tend to disconnect from the concept of school and being a scholar pretty early on. And even when they've made the transition and decided to pursue community college or decided to pursue post-secondary education, those ideas and those concepts around what does it mean to be a man and how does my participation in post-secondary education align with all of the values and assumptions that I've learned and internalized about being a man, how do those things align, that creates some conflict and creates some anxiety that can lead to guys disconnecting and disengaging, especially now when things are really, really difficult. So those are three things to keep in mind when we're enacting these practices that we talked about, and in particular the practice around being intrusive. We really have to think about these students in that regard. Luke, maybe.
And then this will be the.
Yep, go for it.
And this will be the last question for me. And this comes from J. Nicholas Geist. And it says, for those of us with tenure or in other positions of influence at our institutions, what are some of the most powerful and beneficial institutional policies we can push for in this wacky time? And I actually believe that what we really have to do is immediately transition to a case management model where particularly for those who are in student services, as well as for instructional faculty, for every single person at the institution to have a responsibility to proactively reaching out to students, to identifying what their needs are, triaging what the major concerns are, developing a list of commonly asked questions, making those questions available to the students, interceding when there's a need to intercede, and not waiting. And I think that should happen on a weekly basis. So I think that our whole model that we have right now has to transition to respond to the times. And that requires us to be far more intrusive now than ever before.
All right, and to conclude, I'm actually going to conclude with a comment that I think is really instructive and underscores a lot of the strategies that we've talked about and a lot of the trends and issues that we've talked about. It comes from Nikki Love, and she shared, during this webinar, my Wi-Fi struggled and I lost connection 6 times. A perfect reminder what the student experience might be like. I was never worried as I knew the session was being recorded, but now I am aware I can ensure that I prepare students for that happening. So I thought that was a good way to conclude and to underscore everything that we've talked about in this webinar. And with that, again, I want to thank you all for participating. We really, really hope that you found your time with us valuable today. We encourage you to share the recording with your colleagues who may have not had an opportunity to participate or who may have had to log on late or log on early. And be on the lookout for more information about our next webinar, the one that focuses on equity and student services online. And with that, thank you so much and all the best. And wrapping up what we know has been a very challenging semester for all of us. Go for it, Luke.
Frank, can you go to the next slide so we can just show them the upcoming webinar that our colleagues are doing? Yeah. So these are our colleagues, Eric Felix, Paula Amana, and Cynthia Olivo. And this is a part of a webinar that's being done by the Center for Urban Education, supporting students, colleagues, and community during COVID-19. It's also a free webinar, and this is coming up later today. So if you have the time, we would really encourage you to check it out. These are good colleagues who do good work.
Thank you.